folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the concluding part of our second week of looking at things from the Germans' point of view. So battles, and in today's case, kind of remembrance and commemoration. So just as always, if you are new to the channel, because we've got a few new subscribers this week, please don't forget to share what we're doing on social media. The links you need are in the description below, and consider becoming a patron and a channel member. And thank you to the new channel members and patrons who've joined this week. It's most appreciated. Thank you very much. So today's topic, it's an interesting one for me because I've been a Normandy guide, as you know, for 20 plus years here in Bayeux, and there's about 150 tour guides in Normandy, and the question pretty much every tour guide gets every day is, do the Germans come to Normandy, and what do they feel when they get there? Now, that's not quite the question we're going to be asking today. We're looking at how commemoration of the fallen is conducted within Germany, but it's a question that kind of connects to that, and I'm interested to know what the answers are to that, and I'm interested to know what we're going to be learning today. So my guest, Lisa Marie Freitag, is a PhD candidate in Potsdam University. I'm also aware that Philip Blood is watching, so I'm hoping Phil will join in with some comments because he is a Brit who's been living in Germany for at least 2 decades, I think. He'll correct me if I'm wrong on that. So Phil maybe has some experiences of how commemoration differs from country to country. But I'm going to bring Lisa Marie in now. So good evening, Lisa. How are you today?
Hi, I'm good. How are you?
I'm very well. So this is an interesting subject, and it's the first time we've tackled this from the German point of view. So often we've had footage from British cemeteries in Normandy and around the world. We've talked about gravestones and grave sites and reflection and remembrance. We've talked about the commemorations in Normandy and other battles. Singapore, notably the 80th anniversary of that, came up earlier this year. But the one thing that us English language viewers want to know is kind of how has it been going on in Germany. But so before we get into that, just tell us a little bit about yourself. I said there you're a PhD candidate. Obviously you're probably bilingual, if not trilingual, but where did your interest in World War II begin?
Well, it was a bit something that came with my family. I'm a teacher's daughter, and I had 3 history teachers in my family, and they had different expertise and interests, and my dad was actually a big military geek, so to say. So I was engaged with military history and like the World War II and National Socialism quite from an early age on, and then in school I sort of developed that expertise, but back at the time I always wanted to do something artistic, so it took me until 2015 to come back to this topic when I myself wanted to become a history teacher. And I started my degree in Potsdam, and in Potsdam I got introduced to the chair of war studies, which is led by Sönke Neitzel, as you probably know, and he sort of introduced me to the topic on a more professional level, and unintentionally he sparked my passion for military history. So after my bachelor's degree, I studied international war studies in Potsdam and in Dublin. And then I came back when the pandemic hit and started my PhD, and I'm now writing about Manfred Wörner, who was the Minister of Defense of West Germany in the 1980s. And I kind of write a mixture of a biography and an organizational history of the Ministry of Defense.
Well, that's one of the most thorough answers to that question I've ever had. So thank you very much for that. And generally, we've had a lot of people of the similar age and similar kind of background to yourself doing war studies. We've had them from Britain and America and Australia and things like that. And the first question I'm going to ask before we bring up the presentation is it considered kind of odd to be studying the war in Germany still? I mean, Britain, we just know how huge the interest in World War II is, because there are festivals and there are commemorations and there are air displays and air shows and 40s weekends and 40s nights, and 40s culture is kind of sometimes seems to be everywhere. But in Germany, World War II obviously has a very, very different legacy. So is it considered kind of a bit odd to be studying it there?
Well, I guess in the wider public, yes, especially when you are like a female, sometimes you get a bit of a strange look, but that changes. Like For example, in my cohort, we were a lot of females, and we also try in Potsdam to make it a bit more interdisciplinary. So it's not only focused on history, but also on politics and sociology. Sorry, I haven't talked English in a long time. But we do have our networks as well. There is the Arbeitskreis für Militärgeschichte, and that does a huge job to open the field up to other fields and to the wider public. And I think we are on a good way to establish that a bit more in historiography.
Yeah, and I guess, we'll bring up the presentation in a minute. I guess the weird benefit of the COVID era is that everybody was kind of forced to contact each other via the internet, via email and Zoom and all these kind of resources. So I think in a weird way, it did open up the world, because universities were able to make contact with other universities overseas. And the fact that I'm now doing this channel and 540 shows in or something is all because of the repercussions of COVID. So I'm guessing it's a beginning of a good era, in the sense that communicating with people around the world with similar interests has never been easier than it is right now. And people with social media and these kind of platforms, it's easy to kind of feel part of a bigger community. And I know that some of the people I've had as guests who perhaps they're in New Zealand or Australia, where they feel they're part of a small community kind of locally, but they're part of a big community globally. So I think that's something to be positive about. But anyway, Lisa's come prepared with a PowerPoint presentation. What we're going to do today, folks, is we're going to go through the presentation first, sort of 20 minutes, 25 minutes, some of that. Then we'll do questions at the end, everybody. So I'm feeling we will get a lot of interesting questions about commemoration and remembrance, and even just the language. I was saying before we went live, how words like commemoration, remembrance, celebration, they all come loaded with certain kind of meanings. And, in living as I do in Normandy, is it okay to celebrate the events of June the 6th, or is it better to commemorate the events of June the 6th? Remembrance, these are kind of questions that have no easy answers. I noticed David O'Keefe is watching and joining in. So David, in Canada, those words mean something perhaps different there than they here do in Normandy, and they mean something again different in Germany. Anyway, I'm going to hand over to our guest to take us through war commemoration in Germany from 1945 to today. So over to you then.
Thank you so much, Paul, for the invitation and also for the introduction. As we already said a couple of times, I will be talking about war commemoration in Germany from 1945 to today. This is a topic I was very much engaged during my bachelor's degree. So I haven't worked in this field professionally for some time, but obviously I'm still interested in it, and I follow the developments in society and culture. So, and just as a little disclaimer, I will be focusing on commemorating the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, because that's my expertise. There's obviously a lot more in Germany when we talk about war commemoration, especially the Holocaust, but I will be focusing on the Wehrmacht. And when we talk about human losses of the Wehrmacht during World War II, we talk about 5.3 million fallen soldiers, and these are added by around 30,000 international volunteers that served and died in the Wehrmacht. 2/3 of these had fallen at the Eastern Front, and half of them died during the last 12 months of the war, most of them between January and April 1945, with an estimated number of about 10,000 fallen soldiers per day. The majority of these fallen soldiers were army soldiers. That's pretty obvious because of the high numerical share of army soldiers in the Wehrmacht, and also their deployment on the Eastern Front. And in a lot of these cases, the deaths were only evident years after the war had ended, and a lot of men remained missing and are even missing until today. So this is a devastating outcome after more than 5 years of war, and that emerged the question, for what did the soldiers of the Wehrmacht die? And this question repeatedly sparked conflict of commemoration when the fallen were publicly remembered in West Germany after 1945. It remained controversial to what extent the political goals that the soldiers had served for should be taken into account beyond the qualities of their job as being soldiers for the commemoration of the dead, especially when remembrance had to take a tradition-creating function. This then created an ambivalence after 1945. On the one side, we had the private mourning for the loss of a relative who had been killed in action, and also the religious duty to commemorate the dead, as well as also the need of veterans to commemorate or remember their dead comrades. And on the other side, we had the political legitimization of the West German Republic as a democracy that rested on its clear differentiation to the Nazi regime. So it was obvious that the Wehrmacht soldiers did not die for the German Republic, and this created an ambivalence between commemoration of the dead as a positive mode of remembrance versus negative references to recent German past of dictatorship and war. So in the next couple of minutes, I want to start by how commemoration developed just years after the war until around the 1950s, 1960s. Then I want to talk about the Volkstrauertag, which we call the People's Day of Mourning, and the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, that is our German War Graves Commission who initiates the Volkstrauertag. Then I want to also talk about the Bundeswehr and how war is commemorated in our Federal German Army, and at that point we also have to talk about military tradition. And then I will be touching upon war commemoration in memorials and monuments. And as a specific example, I will tell you a little bit about the Neue Wache, the New Guard in Berlin. And then I will talk about our main focus on commemorating the Second World War, namely the victims of war and tyranny, Opfer von Krieg und Gewaltherrschaft, as we say in German. And then, last but not least, I will briefly touch upon new developments in German commemorative culture in recent years. So, with the end of the Second World War, the downfall of the Third Reich, and the total defeat of the Wehrmacht, the positive meaning of the soldiers' death was no longer possible. In the immediate post-war years, there was a critical examination of the Wehrmacht in the course of Allied denazification processes that fell behind, however, during the 1950s. At that time, there were references to timeless norms such as duty, defending the home country, and national as well as military honor. Commemoration at that time was mainly led by veterans, especially by the generals who defined how we should commemorate in their memorial literature. Already at the time, the victims narrative, which will pop up repetitively in my presentation, emerged, and the saying here was that the West Germans, and with them the soldiers of the Wehrmacht, were misemployed by Hitler and his entourage for the National Socialist ideology and the war. And the suffering of the Germans was expressed in the experiences of flight, expulsion, war captivity, and homecoming. In the course of these developments, the dead were also commemorated as victims, or the dead soldiers were also commemorated as victims. However, we didn't have a common cult of the death, no national memorial, and no central ritual of commemoration at that time. It was much more an establishment of decentral locations of commemorations as well as decentral rituals. However, already in 1952, the so-called Volkstrauertag was reintroduced to West German commemorative culture. It is a national holiday that happens 2 Sundays before the 1st of Advent, and it was actually a tradition that rested or that came from the Weimar Republic. And it was established in 1919 by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, of whom I will talk about in just a second, as a day of remembering the fallen soldiers of the First World War. During the time of the Nazis, this Volkstrauertag was repurposed into the so-called Heldengedenktag, so the day of commemorating of heroes. So we had heroization instead of commemoration. And only then after the downfall of the Third Reich, there was a slow reorientation with occasions and free spaces to commemorate the war dead. And in the 1950s, we already had this development that the Bundestag and the federal parliaments, as well as town councils, held hours of remembrance with breath-laying ceremonies. And usually the mourners would meet at a local war memorials, which were usually also memorials from the First World War. And what they did is that they just added the numbers of the Second World War. So they used the same memorials and just reinterpreted them, which is obviously a process of generalization and kind of problematic, but maybe we can talk about that in the discussion. Today, the Volkstrauertag is our national day of mourning, and we have an official ceremony at the Bundestag, which is always held under a specific topic. We always have a guest speaker as well. In 2018, it was Emmanuel Macron, and I think 2 years ago, it was Prince Charles. And also we have different memorial celebrations all over Germany. As already mentioned, the Volkstrauertag was introduced by the Volksbund Deutsche Kriegsgräberfürsorge, which is our War Graves Commission. It was founded also just after the First World War in December 1919, and the task that they imposed on themselves were the erection and maintenance of German war graves at home and abroad, and also the support and help for relatives in all manners regarding the care of war graves, and then also the international war grave maintenance on the basis of mutuality. During the Nazi regime, there was a form of Gleichschaltung, so consolidation of the Volksbund, and it adapted itself towards the National Socialist ideology and removing itself from its previous intentions. By autumn 1944, the Volksbund was on the verge of being completely absorbed by Nazi organization, and this was only not happening since the Third Reich ceased to exist in 1945. In the post-war years, the Volksbund was slowly refounded until 1951, and it was reduced to West Germany only because it was actually forbidden in the GDR. The task at the beginning of this period was to re-erect the organization itself and also collecting information and restore the war graves at home. Already in 1952, the international work began with the erection and maintenance of war graves abroad. And this is also their main task today, maintenance and erection of war graves in Germany and abroad. And on top of that, they're responsible for the discovery, the identification, and the reburial of fallen soldiers, especially in Germany and in Europe, which are still found until today. When we look at war commemoration in the Bundeswehr, we always have to talk about the problem of military tradition. We had, and still have actually sometimes, a continuous problem of fallen Wehrmacht soldiers being worthy of tradition within the Bundeswehr. And this becomes especially visible in naming of barracks and other Bundeswehr facilities, which dead were supposed to be commemorated as role models in the Bundeswehr was a question that is directly related to the Bundeswehr leadership philosophy, the concept of the innere Führung, the inner leadership, and the overall approach of the Staatsbürger in uniform, which means the citizen in uniform. And this changed leadership philosophy forced also a change in values that aimed at a new understanding of military tradition. The novelty here was a radically changed attitude towards war, which was now no longer considered a chance for male probation, as well as the maxim of combining the free man in the army with the fully fledged soldier. This, however, led to conflicts and controversies, especially in the first decades of the Bundeswehr, and it took the Bundeswehr a long time to come to terms with the past and finding a worthy military tradition. The background here is obviously that the Bundeswehr is or was established as a completely new army with a completely different mission and a completely different purpose, but there were a lot of continuities between Wehrmacht and Bundeswehr because the Bundeswehr was built up with veterans of the Wehrmacht. And these veterans especially felt sort of defamation by the Allies and the young German Federal Republic and created a stubborn culture of commemoration as commanders in their barracks. Many continued to uphold the heritage of the old Reichswehr and Wehrmacht units. And this was then, sorry, I live next to a police station. And this then was taken into account in the first tradition decree that was written in 1965, and it had an effect, but however, that quickly faded out. It was then in the 1960s that we had a demographic change with a change in generations, and that also led to a change in our commemorative culture. Because in the course of the 1970s, West Germans redefined their relationship to the Nazi regime. And this then became visible in the new tradition decree of 1982, which stated that the Third Reich and with it the Wehrmacht were no longer worthy of tradition. And I quote from that decree, it says, "The yardsticks for the understanding and cultivation of tradition in the Bundeswehr are the basic law and the tasks and duties assigned to the Bundeswehr." So here again, we had to ask ourselves, what did the soldiers of the Wehrmacht die for, but also at the same time, for what were the soldiers of the Bundeswehr ready to die? And for a tradition-building commemoration of the death, we had this answer had to be placed within an interpretive context. So this created new forms of commemorations, which become visible in the naming of barracks and other Bundeswehr facilities. They can be named after personality who, and I quote again, have rendered outstanding services to freedom and justice through their entire activities or an outstanding deed. This means that institutions of dictatorships are excluded per se, but there are still the possibilities of having Wehrmacht soldiers and people of the Third Reich, but that must be examined in each individual case, whether they can be considered as role models according to this criterion. And this is actually still the norm until today. We had a new tradition decree in 2018, and this also now included the soldiers of the NVA, so of the army of the GDR. And when we look at this criterion with outstanding services to freedom and justice, the first obvious men that come into mind of the Wehrmacht are obviously the military resistance. So we still have a lot of barracks. I have an example here in the picture that are named after these men. When we look at monuments, these were usually erected in cemeteries and were mostly initiated by the administrative bodies. So the broad public was hardly involved in this process. And what we see a lot of times is the multiple use of Christian formal, pictorial, and verbal language. A sort of icon is always the Christian cross that we can also see here. This is a picture from the war cemetery in Halbe. And this Christian language offered a connection of the violent death with the perspectives of reconciliation and resurrection. And there was also the use of secular intentions, which we can see on the upper left-hand picture. So a common saying is, the dead remind us to live for peace. And what we also have a lot of times is the depiction of the dead in the arms of the Pietà, which is, I hope, a little bit visible in the upper right-hand picture. So it's a dead son, usually in the arms of his mother. And when we talk about these monuments, they were exclusively commemorating fallen soldiers. Those were almost only erected directly in connection with the soldiers' graves. So you won't see these usually any other place than the war graves themselves. Frequent motive, as I already said, is the mourning female figure. The only exception, or one of the very few exceptions, is the memorial of the German army, which is located on the Ehrenbreitstein fortress in Koblenz. And this is the picture on the lower right-hand side. It depicts a figurative representation of a soldier laid to rest with a stylized oak wreath. One specific example for a monument and a memorial is the Neue Wache, the New Guard in Berlin. This was erected between 1816 and 1818 as a guardhouse for the Royal Palace, which was on the opposite side, and also as a memorial for the War of Liberation from 1813. In 1931, the memorial was redesigned as a memorial for the fallen of the First World War, and it was a memorial specifically related to Berlin and Prussia. During the Nazi regime, the New Guard remained a central location for commemorating at the Heldengedenktag, which I talked about earlier, and it was heavily damaged by bombing and artillery, as we can see on the left-hand side. After 1945, the New Guard was located on the territory of the GDR, and there were different ideas what to do with it. One very common idea was to just tear it down. The GDR loved to do that with anything they regarded related to the monarchy and militarism. But the New Guard survived and was reconstructed between 1951 and 1957. And in 1961, it was established as a memorial for the victims of fascism and militarism. And you can see that on the lower right-hand side. What they did here was a combination of commemorating the fallen soldiers as well as the resistance fighters, which was a very huge deal for the GDR. And inside there was this prism structure with an eternal flame placed at the center of the hall, underneath a hole in the roof. Underneath this prism structure, they buried the remains of an unknown soldier and also the remains of an unknown prisoner of one of the concentration camps. And with them, they buried underneath a plate of the unknown prisoner earth from 9 different concentration camps. And beneath the plate of the unknown soldiers, they buried earth of 9 different battlegrounds of the Second World War. Then after the fall of the Berlin Wall, the Neue Wache was again redesigned, and since then it has its shape that it has now, and it became the central German memorial to commemorating the victims, as we say, of the First and Second World War. In the middle now we have this larger-than-life statue, which is called Mother with Her Dead Son by the artist Käthe Kollwitz, which is placed on a sign which says for the victims of war and tyranny, so den Opfern von Krieg und Gewaltherrschaft, and this is also the dedication of the memorial. And they also placed the statue underneath that roof, that hole in the roof, and during like snow and rain, it rains down and it snows down, and that is supposed to, you know, show the sufferings of the Germans and during the wartime. So it's also kind of like an artistic feature. What they kept was the remains of the soldier, the unknown soldier, and the unknown prisoner of the concentration camp. And they also kept the different earths with them. So here is a direct link to the commemoration of the death in the GDR without a critical questioning of the same. And with this saying of victims of war and tyranny, we have an equality of all groups of victims of the Second World War. And this memorial can also be seen as the climax of the federal German cult of victimization. Now I want to quickly touch upon this saying of den Opfern von Krieg und Gewaltherrschaft. This is a very important part of our commemorative culture, and it's kind of a compromise that we have. Because before 1945, I briefly touched upon that, we had this idea of heroization and sacrifice. So soldiers and people died for the home country and for the nation, and now they were victims of something, of war, of tyranny. And this heroization became obsolete with the crimes of the National Socialist regime. So we had a question about the meaning of the deaths during the Second World War. And this deliberate abandonment of the heroization of violent deaths led to lengthy conflicts over the manifestation of remembrance. And the commemoration of soldiers developed at the same time as the commemoration of the victims of the National Socialists' crimes. And the associated controversies arose from the view that the German commemoration of fallen soldiers could not be separated from the criminal aims of the military actions, and therefore it was not possible to grant the dead soldiers a perpetual memory or a special tribute. Newly created monuments were deliberately designed to be apolitical and used religious design features. I already mentioned that as well. And with this denationalization and universalizing the cult of the fallen soldiers, we had the possibility to escape the complexities of the political interpretations. And also with this universal formula, the focus lies very clearly on the victims of the crimes of the Nazi regime, which are still the center of our commemorative culture for obvious reasons, and even more so after 1990. And so the German fallen soldiers of the Second World War are only included marginally. At the same time, the reduction of the soldiers to the victim's narrative, and this is my thesis and my personal opinion, leads to a fading out of their active dimension of their actions during the war, and also exclude any possibilities for political discussion. And this is obviously highly problematic. In recent years, we have some different developments in our commemorative culture that are actually contrary to one another, and also are in addition to the general and non-binding cult towards victimization. The first is that there is a tendency to erect separate monuments that are dedicated to different groups of victims of the Nazi regime, and a special challenge for military tradition of the remembrance of the fallen are monuments for executed deserters. And one example is the monument that we can see on the top. This was originally located in Bonn, but after the fall of the Berlin Wall, they relocated it to Potsdam. And the other development that we have is the renewal of the monumental cult of the fallen, which becomes visible in the Ehrenmal der Bundeswehr, which is the official Bundeswehr memorial. And this is a monument that not only remembers the fallen of the Bundeswehr, but also soldiers who will fall in the future and whose war deployment has to be legitimized. But here we also have a sort of generalization, because this monument not only remembers soldiers who were killed in actions or during their war deployment abroad, it also remembers any soldiers who died in their service in the Bundeswehr, so also soldiers who were killed in accidents, for example, which is obviously a different context than being killed in action. So, and with that, I'm at the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to the discussion and questions.
Well, thank you very much. And I've made loads of notes here. David O'Keefe, Phil Blood, others have been making lots of notes. They said there's lots of questions coming your way. I mean, I think I'm going to start off, well, other addition to thanking you again for taking us through that, is the word I've underlined 3 times is compromise. And that everything that, as it moves forward, has to be a compromise between the various factions. And I'm thinking about the show we did a few weeks ago about the fact that the Brookwood Cemetery in Britain, there are murderers on the same memorial. You know, literally, people who murdered women who were in the British Army or RAF are on the same name of the fallen as those who died in combat in Europe. So that cemetery is a compromise between honoring people who deserve being honored and honoring people who don't deserve to be honored. And obviously, the questions that are coming in are about the fact how focusing on the victims seems the logical way forward, but who defines who the victims are? And that clearly someone who has been persecuted by the Third Reich is an absolute victim, but a guy called up at 17 years old to serve his country in the Wehrmacht, who does his job, is he a victim or is he part of this? And we have done shows about the fact that the Wehrmacht are not free of complicity. They were involved in massacres as well. So lots and lots of things to unpack here, but definitely compromise is the word, I think, going forward. I'm going to hand over to questions from other people. People are saying thank you very much for doing that. The equality of all victims, I think, is a key thing you said there. I underlined that as well. And that's obviously changing as the politics changes and different political factions and opinions come and go. And Phil Blood said something a minute ago. I'll try and find it again. He says, this is not an easy subject because it's increasingly complex due to politics, but also cultural attitudes. So it's something that's progressing as we go along. But that's my kind of opening as the host comments there. We will do some questions now. So we'll do one from Rolf here. How does Lisa Marie Freitag view monuments to the old Wehrmacht heroes such as Hans-Joachim Marseille and Erwin Rommel?
Yeah, I think this is another huge deal that we have in Germany, because maybe you heard of that as well. We have this repeatedly discussion of renaming streets, renaming monuments, rededicating monuments. And I think in some cases this is maybe necessary. But I am not a huge fan of just taking away everything, kind of like just like renaming everything, because I think that's what history is about. It's about engaging with the subject. It's about engaging with the people. And, you know, obviously if it's a war criminal, then that's a different subject. But if it's a person that is very ambivalent, and even somebody like Stauffenberg was a very ambivalent person, then those monuments and street names and whatnot, they invite us to think about them and to understand their actions and to understand their motives. And I think that's so important. That's also something that I find so super problematic about this generalization, because it puts people like a Wehrmacht soldier on the same level as a prisoner of a concentration camp. And it doesn't work. Like, I mean, it works, but it doesn't work on a professional level. And I think to understand what roles they play, we need to engage with these people, and we don't engage when we just tear them away and take them out. So I think we should keep at least those ambivalent people in our surroundings and invite people to engage with them.
No, definitely. And, again, I'm going to bring it back to the fact that I find it rather uncomfortable when Facebook and social media references talk about all the Allied soldiers being heroes. They are all heroes. They are all the greatest generation. I have just as much of a problem with that. I have no problem with saying most of them were, nearly all of them were. But, we had our share of murderers and evil people and people who did barbaric things as well. And I'm not comparing the British and American armies per se with the Third Reich. I'm saying the difficulty of using blanket terms to describe everybody, referring to everybody as heroes or everybody as victims. And this is the nuance. But I think you also said something that is very relevant, is that we need to have these difficult conversations. It's better to talk about it and have the difficult conversations than just ignore it. If we just ignore the difficulty of it, then we're not solving anything at all. So raising questions about, when you said there, the focusing on the victims. So yes, the resistance workers, the victims who worked in camps, that they are clearly victims, and clearly there are perpetrators at the other end. But there's that group in the middle where who decides what their label is. That is very complicated. So I'll just check what questions we've got, because they're talking about, David O'Keefe is talking about statues of Robert E. Lee and Confederate generals in the USA. That's a similar theme that's coming in now. Benjamin Allen is saying, if you remove monuments, you could always place them on private property in a museum. I don't see a problem with changing street names, though. It is just a street, not a monument. And you said there that a lot of the memorials to soldiers, they are in cemeteries, so they're not so much in public places. Whereas, I live in Normandy. I only have to drive 10 minutes away from my house, and I'm going past statues and monuments to individual Allied soldiers and what they accomplished. So in Germany, it's a bit different that it's kept within cemeteries. But there's questions about Hindenburg and Bismarck coming up there as well. So let's try and find another question from this is from Sheldrake 6. Has there been any discussion of renaming Rommel Kaserne in Augustdorf?
I think there was. I don't really know what the end of that discussion was, but like with we had this huge issue of military tradition and remembering the Wehrmacht. I think it was in 2017, so that's why we also had the new tradition decree. So yeah, I can't really answer the question what the result of it was, but I remember that there were some discussions about that, because Rommel is a very special case and a very ambivalent person as well, because obviously there is this discussion whether he knew of the resistance or whether he was part of it, and we can't really answer that with the sources we have. So yeah, that's a very prime example, I think.
Yeah, no, definitely. We've got a question from Phil Bosworth about, you're going back to the Berlin Memorial there, the significance of the 9 types of earth in the grave there. What was that?
So that was like the GDR that initiated it, and they decided to have this idea of placing the unknown soldier next to the unknown prisoner of the concentration camp, and with that they buried the different earths. And I think this was just supposed to be a representation of the suffering and how it was not reduced to one location, but to so many different locations, and just, have a symbolic representation of all that in one place. So, yeah.
Yeah, there's more sort of conversations going on rather than necessarily questions. So it's Philip Blood is saying another issue is in school education where syllabuses have to balance the Holocaust with German history. Younger generations are generally not inclined towards military history. So you are an exception to that. But if you keep, this is the long-term problem is if we keep creating generations of young Germans who feel guilty about events that they were not part of, neither were their fathers, neither even were their grandparents, then the dialogue stops. And we need kids from Germany, France, Britain, Israel, and America and Canada and all the other countries to meet and discuss and find solutions, because my stepdaughters don't think of themselves in the same kind of nationalistic ways that I do. I kind of think of myself as being very much English. They think of themselves very much as being kind of European and citizens of the world, and don't really sort of see borders in that same kind of way. So they wouldn't necessarily think, oh, that friend of mine at university, she is German, she's Israeli or whatever. They would just think she's a friend of mine, he's a friend of mine, without necessarily thinking about that label. So that's something where we're moving forward, I think, hopefully. So any more questions, particularly, I mean, lots of conversations. Thank you very much for your comments there. And I realize this is a really big topic with lots of potential difficulties, and we may not know the answers to these questions. It's about starting a dialogue just here on the channel, I think is interesting. So
maybe I can.
The Wehrmacht exhibition in the 90s also led to serious debates over the Nazi past that made commemoration problematic. Yeah, I mean, what are your feelings now in terms of the fact that what have I've said? Any reaction to what I've said about the youth and moving forward? And as a person sort of 20 plus years younger than me, is it easier? Are you finding it easy to engage in these conversations with people from different countries?
For me, I think it's still a bit different because I obviously view this from a very professional perspective, I guess. And I also remember that I don't want to say I was brought up with this feeling of guilt, but it was still there. So I talked about it earlier that I visited Normandy with my parents when I was like 9 years old. And I remembering standing on the American War Cemetery with all of these white crosses. Everywhere you would look would just be white crosses. And I remember my parents and I feeling so guilty, although we obviously didn't have anything to do with it, but it was still there, this feeling. And I think with the younger generations, that changes now. And I have the same feeling that it's more of a European approach. Obviously, we have a big issue with patriotism and being proud to be Germans. I think that we probably have a little longer way to go. But what I consider as a tragedy as well as a chance is the fading out of the contemporary witnesses, because on the one hand, obviously, we don't have people who tell us about their experiences anymore, although we obviously have possibilities to archive it, which is great. But on the other hand, that opens up new possibilities, especially in education. So with the war graves, for example, they used to be and still are a place where people would go to mourn their relatives who had fallen during the Second World War. And this changes now, so this happens less and less. And what is the development now? The Volksbund has a really big organizational structure where they work with youth, and they have youth coming to these places, and they kind of repurpose these war graves as locations for education. And I think that's such a great chance to have a different perspective on it. And obviously the Holocaust is important and it will remain the main focus of our commemorations, and that's totally fair enough. But I think there is a change towards considering that there were other victims as well, and that there were also, like young boys of 15, 16 who were deployed at the end of the war, and then they died in the Wehrmacht and didn't really have anything to do with the ideology or with the war itself. And I think that these war graves are a great location to do that, because we see their names, their dates, and we can kind of engage with it. And that's a great chance for the future.
And indeed, and it brings us back this idea of the nuance and the complications of deciding who is a victim and who is a perpetrator, and all that sliding scale in the middle of, as you say, a 15-year-old kid who's thrust into combat at the end of the war, who doesn't even understand the political ideology, let alone follow it and support it, and yet they're still part of that regime. So it is complicated. Philip Blood is asking about. Did you have you seen old soldiers commemorating the dead, and have you witnessed that, and does it still go on, and what are your feelings? Does it go on? I mean, in Normandy where I live, the British veterans still come over. American veterans, they still go and see their fallen comrades, and that's considered a totally acceptable thing to do and a wonderful thing to do. Is it considered okay in Germany if you're a veteran or the widow or the children of a veteran to go and visit that grave? Would you do it openly? Would you tell your friends you're doing it? Would you post photos, or would you do it discreetly? I know there may be more than one answer to that, but obviously it goes on. But how is it handled?
Yeah, I think it depends on what kind of context you are doing it. I think to just do it publicly, that doesn't happen much, but people do that. They go to the graves. When you go to Halbe, which, by the way, I can totally recommend when you are in Berlin, it's like, I think, 50 kilometers outside of Berlin. It's the biggest inner German war cemetery we have, and there you see some war graves with pictures, with flowers. So there are people coming and commemorate their relatives. And also in Halbe, they have like these reburial ceremonies basically every year, where they rebury all of the remains that they have found during the year, and those are usually a couple of hundred. So there is still a lot going on, and that is a very public and very open procedure. So the Bundeswehr is there to bury them. They usually invite other armies from abroad, and they do it as a cooperation. So there is exchange, and there is also veterans come to the Volksbund and engage with them. So this still happens, and there's also sort of this I think this idea that this is important to do. I'm a member of the Volksbund, and I did that because my great granddad was a soldier in the Wehrmacht, and he said it's important to commemorate my comrades. And when he died, my great grandmother continued this tradition, and when she died, I said I would continue it now. So I think there is a sort of, it happens, but it's not such an open public space, and it's also not about oh, this is my granddad, he did something very great and he was a brave soldier. It's much more like mourning and sadness, and it's like that's a very quiet process.
Yeah, and thank you for explaining that. I think it does raise the question: is it possible to commemorate someone even if they fought for the wrong side and the wrong ideal? And I think probably the answer has to be yes to that. You can still mourn that person, you can still miss that person, you can still wish they were around, had lived to be an old man, but it doesn't mean you have to exclude the fact that they were on the wrong side and they were fighting for a cause that was intrinsically wrong. Sheldrake is asking a question about where will your research go from here. You said this is your earlier research, not what you're working on right now, but given the fact that there is now this international community, there's David O'Keefe is joining us in Canada, Sheldrake's in Canada, there's Phil in Aachen, is that what would you like to see happen in terms of research into this and the understanding of commemoration? What areas would you like to see development done in?
Well, I think commemorative culture is a huge topic in research, and I think there has been a lot has been done in the past couple of years. What I always want to advocate for is looking at biographies. I said that earlier. I would like to, I know that probably in the public space this is not possible and we have to compromise, but I think in research we have the possibilities to differentiate and to look at biographies and look at different people and try to understand their motives, their ways, their ideas. Obviously, this is not possible in every case because we need the sources, but I would like to see that, to just look at the different individuals and judge them upon that and not use this generalization and say, that's the Wehrmacht, that's bad because, you know, it's a national socialist and all of them are bad, and even more Waffen-SS bad. So if you randomly pick a person from the Wehrmacht and randomly pick a person from the Waffen-SS and put them next to each other, maybe the Wehrmacht guy was committed way worse war crimes.
Yeah.
We don't know that. So, but there is this attitude, oh, they're good, they're bad, and I think that's what is so important, that we look at the individuals and judge them after we looked at their individual cases.
Absolutely, and I like to expand that. I mean, Benjamin is saying, to reiterate, victims can be perpetrators too. The labels are not mutually exclusive, and also, as we said about the Allied cemeteries, not all the victors are also heroic. That they can have been perpetrators as well of other careers, of other crimes, things like that. So the paradox we face is that the only fair way is to judge everybody individually, but who is the judge, and by what standards do you judge them? Because the standards are changing. As one of the ongoing topics on World War II TV is the now in 2022 we understand that the clean Wehrmacht does not exist, as that they were, as you said, not all of them, but the Wehrmacht, the Luftwaffe, were also involved in some horrible crimes as well, which is something that wasn't kind of thought about back in the 50s and 60s. So now we accept that's the case. But taking that on board, we then still can't deny the fact that there are individuals within those units who are against the regime they're fighting, and that's the complication. And you can't take every single person who served their countries in World War II and kind of put them through some kind of court process to decide whether they are deserving of memorialization and commemoration or not. And again, as I said, who decides what the rules are and what the criteria are? It's a very complicated subject. And Philip Budd is saying again, the problem with the present situation, we have the old German vets pass without really understanding them. So I think that's the point you're making there, is that we're letting that generation go away without speaking to them in the same way that we've spoken to surviving Allied veterans because they are the quote unquote baddies. And so as they fade away, we're missing the chance of understanding what they feel about the terms of commemoration and remembrance and memorialization. So it is a very, very complicated subject. Barry Milgate is saying that German school children come to Cannock Chase in the UK to tend the graves of German dead from First World War and World War II and stop with local people. So there's a nice project going on that is connecting and about reconciliation. But yeah, there are two people talking about the searching for missing soldiers, and then you say mourning might be easy if the deceased soldier in question didn't fight on the Eastern Front, which is kind of coming back to my idea of Normandy being maybe not a good examination of reconciliation, because we had a cleaner, generally 12th SS excluded campaign here in Normandy. So just in June, so early this month, there were a couple of German veterans in Normandy who were engaging with and shaking hands and hugging American and British veterans. I love to see that going on, but I can't quite see that happening perhaps in Poland yet. So it's different from different countries. But any more comments you think about, Lisa, about kind of direction you'd like to see things go and questions you'd like to see answered?
Yeah, maybe just to touch upon what I said earlier, I think it is important to see that because there was this comment that perpetrators can be victims and the other way around. I think in like extreme cases with war, this is like, I don't want to say normal, but it's a development that happens. And even if we look at the concentration camps, which is obviously the most extreme case here, we have the capos and stuff like that. So I think what is very important is to stop this black and white thinking. And this happens a lot in research, which is good. And I like that to continue. So it's not just good, it's not bad, but there are a lot of different shades in between that. And that's the thing that we need to dig up and try to understand and try to research.
And Sheldrake is reiterating the point: the death of the clean Wehrmacht myth should not lead to an all German vets were war criminals myth. That's swinging it back as to your point there, the other way, saying that there was guilt within the Wehrmacht does not mean it's a blanket across the whole thing. And this brings us back this whole idea about how complicated it is. And Ivan Sordo is saying an outstanding presentation. But in Asia, the issue of Japan regarding war, dead, and responsibility is still being talked about. So they I'm not going to get go into massive great rabbit hole about Japan, but the dialogues aren't really even happening there much yet. Whereas at least we are having this dialogue in a civilized manner. There's me, a Brit, you, a German, David, a Canadian, Sheldrake, another Canadian. We're engaging about this and finding some agreement over this very, very difficult subject. And I'm thinking about that German series that they call it, the German Band of Brothers, about the four friends that went to war. What was it called? The Generation War.
Yeah. Unsere Mütter und Väter, yeah.
Yeah, that raised some ideas of good and bad and being part of something, but also being a victim of it. So it is efforts are being made to find the compromise, find the nuance there. And Jeff Bratton is saying, if you erase history, then there's a possibility of an ideology raising for mythology. The need for discussion and commemoration is a way to maybe break the mythology. So yeah, again, we're saying that dialogue is good. So in terms of your understanding of the eras of how the cemeteries have gone and the memorialization is going, Germany's probably had more changes in the last 80 years than perhaps the British has had. Again, from my point of view, the British Royal Legion, Royal British Legion, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have kind of remained fairly unchanged over the last sort of 1800 years. The poppy still more or less represents what it always did. The commemorations are more or less as they always are. But Germany has been through these various phases. And people are saying this difficult subject, and kudos to you for approaching it. So that's so yeah. Thanking you for even taking it on board. Rolf is asking, how do you feel when I'm not going to try and pronounce that, the ODR? My German is terrible. I'll let you read that. Comes to lay a wreath at an army monument before them. They were the heroes, weren't they?
Yeah, that's a difficult one. Well, in the National Socialist ideology, obviously they were the heroes. But I mean, in a place like a war grave, everybody should have the space to mourn. It doesn't matter if they have like if they received an award or not. And again, like this is something. Look at the people and look at their biographies. I wrote my master thesis about a Iron Cross represent in the German Navy and tried to understand his way of life and his motives and what he did and why he did things that he did. And again, I can just advocate to look at the people and not judge them overall, not say those were the heroes, those were the victims, and those were the perpetrators, because it's not as easy as that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm going to bring it back to what I said at the beginning about the fact that in Normandy we get asked all the time, do Germans come to Normandy and what do they think? And I'm going to ask you the question, do you think it should be possible for a German family to come to Normandy to lay flowers on their relative and be in the public about it and not have to hide and to talk about it? Do you think that should be possible without any kind of negative reaction from anybody?
Yeah, sorry, my connection was a bit low. Yeah, definitely. I think that should be possible. I think war graves are the best location to practice peace and to also, to get in connection with other nationalities and other people from other countries, and to just talk about the different experiences. And nobody should feel guilty to go to Normandy to mourn their relative or to understand what happened there. I think that's something that should be open to everybody and everyone. And this feeling of guilt, again, I think That's something that fades away in Germany as well. Even though we have this moral responsibility, which I think is totally right. But this feeling of guilt, that's something that just fades away slowly, and I think that's good.
And Colin Taylor, my guiding friend here in Normandy, is saying that yes, everybody in those cemeteries is someone's son. I know Colin is a real advocate of that on his tours. He always says, no, regardless of what they did, everybody who fell is still someone's son. They're still someone's relative, and that doesn't go away. I'm thinking also of Albert Schweitzer's a great statement about war graves are the great communicators for peace. So that's up on the walls of various cemeteries in museums in Normandy, and that's worth reiterating, I think. We've got a good question from Leslie about, is there a commemorative flower in Germany similar to the cornflower in France and the poppy in the UK? Does Germany have a flower that symbolizes remembrance?
I think we do have the cornflower as well. That's the blue one, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, we do have that. It's a sign for veterans, actually. So the Volksbund uses it. It's there when they are out and about and on their duty. They have a little pin. And also the veteran communities of the Bundeswehr use the cornflower. So I think it's not like as much of a symbol as, for example, the poppy, but it still kind of represents something in German commemorative culture.
Okay, thank you. And the final thing I think is about this linguistic idea, in that someone was saying earlier that one of the museums they went to at Remagen was advertising and listing itself as a peace museum rather than a war museum, and there were no things outside it like tanks and guns and cannons, whereas perhaps in Britain a museum can be advertised as a war museum and there can be a tank sitting right in front of it with its gun pointing towards the road there. So I'm guessing Germany has to be more careful with its language of how it even a museum has to kind of not be seen to be celebrating things. And again, it's that use of the words commemoration, remembrance, memorialization, education, as opposed to kind of celebration. Because there are undoubtedly museums that I know, even here in Normandy, that are all about pretty much celebrating the stuff. It's, here are tanks, aren't they cool, everybody? And people kind of accept the fact that's what some of the museums are about here. Come and look at a half track, come and look at a tank, come and look at all these things there. Others are more kind of idea about the kind of human experience and the fallen and the individual. So, but Germany, obviously, language comes into it much more importantly, I'm guessing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess there's also a little bit of a change nowadays, or has been in the past 10 years, I would say, with the deployment of the Bundeswehr in war areas such as Afghanistan. It took us I think 8 years to call the conflict in Afghanistan a war. But since that time, we have become much more aware of the fact that we still have soldiers of the Bundeswehr that are killed in action. And therefore, I think there is sort of also this, what I talked about at the last part, that we have a little bit of a shift in commemorating the fallen of the Bundeswehr, because we talk about war again, and we have to talk about war again. And I think that's a good development for Germany to I don't want to say liberate itself, but to just move towards a different kind of language when we talk about commemorating fallen soldiers nowadays.
Well, I mean, it's interesting because in Britain we've had the 40th anniversary of the Falkland Islands coming into the news again, and it's showing that there are still active veterans associations concerned with that war. Because one of the things I know from where I used to live in England is that the Royal British Legion clubs were failing to attract younger members because the World War II generation had kind of left such a powerful legacy of what they had accomplished, that if you'd served in the British Army in the 70s or 80s in Germany or somewhere else, or in Northern Ireland, where the wars were a little bit less clear-cut and the politics was a bit more complicated, the younger veterans didn't feel the connection and the reason to join those kind of organizations. So what I'm understanding is that in Germany now, because of these current affairs, that the young, and I mean people retiring out of the Bundeswehr today, are maybe feeling more that they can join a veterans association now in 2022 than they perhaps could have done 30 years ago. Is that right?
Yeah, I would say so as well. Yes, we do have these these organizations, obviously, and they have quite a good public standing. Obviously, we still have these developments in our society that completely, want to basically banish the Bundeswehr. But a lot has happened, especially in the past couple of years, with the Bundeswehr being much more introduced into the public sphere. And I think that's good because, at the end, they do this on their own voluntary choice, and they serve our country. So, yeah, we should give them a place in our society because that's where they come from. And I think that's also a development that, is coming from this experiences of Afghanistan and other war deployments to say, yeah, soldiers get killed in these conflicts, and we have to talk about it, and we have to mourn them, and we have to find a political meaning in their deaths. And that has sparked quite a bit of discussion, but also I think discussion is always good. So yeah.
No, definitely, and as you said, the Bundeswehr is a completely different, separate organization from a separate country than the World War II era. Whereas, and this is the other thing where we can compare it with Britain again, is that the British regimental histories goes back to the colonial era. So there's dark passages in our past, there's dark passages in the past of the USA and Canada as well, with its indigenous peoples, things like that. And it's a big, wider question about at what point do you let go the darkness of the past, but with that, but or do you keep it and talk about it and make sure we are all aware that our countries have been through different chapters of different eras and things that we perceived one way 100 years ago and now perceived differently now. But I think, and Phil Budd is saying there are hundreds of unofficial Wehrmacht and even SS veterans associations that first started in the late 1940s. So they're old soldiers, regardless of who they fought for and under what, always had a tendency to want to meet up and gather together for various reasons. And if you were to ask, like you said, if you were to compare a guy from the Wehrmacht with a guy from the Waffen SS, if you were to ask any veteran from different nations why are they members of a veterans association, they would all give you different reasons. Some would be to remember their fallen comrades, some would be because of the comradeship they felt themselves, some out of a sense of duty to continue. There's no blanket answer to that either. So yeah, it is not, as I suspected, today's discussion has raised as many questions as it has answered them. But the good thing is the dialogue has been started. So I think, folks, we will bring things to an end there. And what we'll consider is maybe doing some kind of panel discussion in the future with some other people and bring Lisa Marie back on and maybe some other people and discuss this again. But I'm with you. I hope the future is going to be better. I hope that the dialogues will continue. I hope that France, Germany, Britain, the USA, and all these other countries will be able to move forward discussing these things without getting angry at each other and understanding that the French way of remembrance is different to the German and different to the British, and that we can find a balance. We can find compromise all the way through. So I think that's the main thing there. So well, there we are. I'm just going to take you off screen for a second to tell what we've got coming up, and I'll bring you back on in a second. So, folks, as usual, nothing this weekend. And next week, kind of a random section of shows. I'm still trying to find a couple of last-minute ones because things were a bit difficult to organize. But then early July will be Animals at War Week, where I'm co-hosting with Lucy Betteridge Dyson. So it'll be me and another face on screen for that. And I've already been working on a couple of weeks of programming in August about the Pacific War. We've got lots of events, shows to commemorate the Normandy campaign of late July coming up in July. So lots more stuff coming up. Thank you for the questions. Thank you for the discussion tonight. It's been really fantastic. And I definitely feel there's more things we can talk about in the future. I'm going to bring our guests back on just basically to say thank you very much. So, yeah, no terribly hard questions there in the end. I mean, well, not awful questions, and it proves that people are very interested in this subject. So thank you very much for kind of beginning the conversations. And would you like to come back again if we can arrange some kind of panel discussion about this?
Yeah, sure. I'd love to.
Brilliant. Well, there we are. Well, thanks, everybody. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. I will see you after the weekend. So have a good one, everybody. Cheers, everybody. Bye.
Bye. Thank you.